We come today to what many of us consider probably the most glorious theme in the whole gospel. This is the heart of man as saint. Remember, in this series on man, oh man, the three faces of Adam, we're now up to lecture 7, which is in this area we call man as sinner. But we began, first of all, with man as man, and then we took up the subject of man as sinner, and then in this area where we are today, man as saint. Man as sinner, we noticed, hates God, and he hates man, and he hates himself, and that the story of man as a saint begins spiritually and dynamically with the theme we last considered, namely his regeneration. But the way, the transaction by means of which he actually becomes a saint is by this glorious method of justification, by faith alone. We want to look at that in its broad outlines in this lecture, and in the lectures which follow, we'll focus on the details, such as the faith, its justification, and the works which follow, indeed right on into the other world, where they are perfected, and man, the saint, becomes indeed the glorified and perfected saint. But today it is our privilege to look at what Martin Luther called the article or doctrine by which the church stands or falls. That is, this truth of acceptance with God through faith in Jesus Christ alone, which was the liberation of his own burdened soul, and through him the re-enunciation of the gospel in its purity in the 16th century, which requires the same kind of vigorous fidelity even more in this 20th century. If Luther called it the article by which the church stands or falls, Calvin was no less zealous for this doctrine, which he referred to as the hinge of the Reformation. Since this is so important, both as a doctrine and also as an historical development, let me take just a moment to indicate, in a brief review of the history of doctrine, how this utterly central message of Christianity was articulated so definitively and so crucially and so polemically in the 16th century. After the Bible was closed and the canon was completed and the special revelation of God given to the church for the faithful proclamation of it until Jesus Christ should come again, the church was first concerned with the most fundamental of all truths, namely the person of Jesus Christ. And the opening centuries of our Christian history saw debate after debate and controversy after controversy before the church came to a magnificent consensus on the fact that Jesus Christ is very God, and also truly man. Once that doctrine was indisputably established and classically formulated in the early centuries of the Christian church, then the attention slowly moved to the details of his work. His person having been definitively stated, his work was next considered. And so we had, in the work of Augustine, an indication of the depravity of man and the absolute necessity of grace and the beginnings of the formulation of the doctrine of the atonement. But its classic development took place in the Middle Ages, especially with Anselm, whose famous Cur Deus Homo, why did God become man, was itself a definitive statement, by no means exhaustive and perfect, but nevertheless a definitive statement of how Jesus Christ, by his sacrifice, made reconciliation of man and sinner possible. Now, when we come to the 16th century, the focus is on the subjective aspect of salvation. Anselm, as it were, had laid the objective foundation for reconciliation with God in the finished vicarious sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Now the attention was on how this great sacrifice was appropriated by the person, and of course the attention was on faith, and that led to the formulation of the doctrine of justification by faith alone. That was the stress of the 16th century, where there was common agreement on the fact that the God-man, Jesus Christ, had become man in order to die and to provide a propitiatory sacrifice for mankind. There was a unanimous agreement on that, and then came the great question as to how that was appropriated and the articulation of the Protestant Reformation in justification by faith alone. Now, that is in a sense what we're stating here at level 5, that faith brings justification plus works. But in this little anticipatory lecture, we want to give a kind of overview of the present situation. I'm indicating 5 varieties of this doctrine before we get to this final and correct biblical evangelical one. First of all, there is the view of justification we associate with liberalism that I here represent in terms of works. That's our deeds, our acts, leading to justification with God. And this is meant to be a minus faith. Now, it seems strange, but I'll explain in a moment why liberalism is actually opposed to faith. I admit, of course, that on the surface of it they're not, and many liberals who might be hearing this lecture would be absolutely dumbfounded, not at the first part of this, but at my suggesting that they are opposed to faith. But I'll explain that in a moment. They really are, and I'll try to, but I admit the burden of proof is on me, and in a moment I will try to shoulder that. But the second view, that faith brings justification minus works. You notice this first one puts works first, and that's absolutely out of court. It's out of any viable Christian formulation. All of these others, whatever differences they have among themselves, put faith where it belongs first and not last or denied, as in the case of liberalism. But with respect to this view, which is generally recognized as the neo-orthodox view, I've tried to indicate by these dotted lines, faith in dotted lines and justification in dotted lines, that though they do have a basically Christian pattern, it has a peculiar meaning to it. It's faith they talk about, but it's not faith in a recognizable form. And indeed, they ring the changes on justification, but when you examine what they mean by the word, I have to put it in dotted lines. It's not what is normally meant by any of these other views. And that's by far the hardest one to explain, but we will do that in a moment. But once again, they emerge into the light with the use of the word works, and when they talk about Christian deeds and so on, they're talking about the same sort of thing that all the rest of us are talking about. Now, this third matter is very definitely within the conservative field, and I'm referring to it just as antinomianism. I don't know any antinomians who aren't conservatives. Conservatives are, by all means, not necessarily antinomian. As a matter of fact, I don't think it's possible to be a genuine evangelical and to be antinomian. But there can be no denying that we are talking about people here who don't put anything in dotted lines, if anything, bold print, and so on. And they mean faith, and they mean justification, and they mean works, and so on. But will you notice here, what characterizes antinomianism, and which is the occupational hazard of being a conservative, and I'm saying as a conservative to conservatives, it isn't 1, 2, or 4 that threatens you nearly as much as 3 does. And what its error is, antinomian, is that while it does indeed glorify faith and indicates that that is what brings justification, there is a minus before the works. Now here again I'm going to hasten to explain, as I develop this a little bit more fully, that they don't mean to be opposed to works. I want to tell you to do as many sins as you possibly can while you have an opportunity and so on, but they do mean minus in the sense that it is not essential to that formula. You're justified by faith, period. And nothing comes after necessarily. It may be there, but if it's absent, it wouldn't change the situation. Now the fourth one, and which was the center of the Reformation struggle, and is still, as far as official Roman Catholic doctrine is concerned, the doctrine of Rome. That faith, same basic faith we're talking about elsewhere, in Christ crucified and so on, followed by the works of obedience informed by love and so on, lead to justification. You'll notice they have the same ingredients as the last one, just some people would say a minor juxtaposition, but it's a minor juxtaposition. It makes an entirely different doctrine altogether. They have faith here and here. They have works here and here. You have justification here and here, but the works precede the justification. And as we shall show, in the last analysis, in the Roman Catholic view of things, the 16th century and now, your justification, though there's a sense in which faith is its root,
rests on what you do. And that's, of course, diametrically opposite to the proposition that faith rests entirely on what Christ has done. And that justification rests entirely on what he has done, and faith is your act of union with him. But you'll notice, as over against antinomianism, plus works. The works contribute nothing to the justification, but they're absolutely essential to the justified life. If they are absent, the person is not justified. Now you have a brief outline of the 5 basic patterns which have existed and do exist, and only one of which is true and biblical, we believe, and shall try to show, and that is the 5th. And I can't stress too much Luther's sentiment there, with which I agree completely, and even more than completely in a sense, because where he would say that this is the doctrine by which the church stands or falls. I agree with him in that. You can't be a church and deny this doctrine, but I'm saying more than that. I'm saying to each one of you individually, this is the doctrine by which you stand or fall. If you're going to be justified, this is the only way it's going to happen. For you as an individual, and any church which departs from that has to be departing from the gospel as well. But it's absolutely impossible to overstress the importance of this doctrine. Now, very briefly, let me develop these ideas a little bit more. What we mean by suggesting that liberalism proposes justification by works minus faith and so on is that they think that if anybody is acceptable to God, it's on the basis of his own performance. They'll stand on the record. They advocate good works, and they think a just and a holy God will recognize a person for what he's worth, and if he does what's right, God, being a just God, will reward him accordingly. Now, really, modern liberals don't take this doctrine very seriously. They wouldn't even be mentioning it, I don't think, except for the fact that it is a part of religious parlance, because they really... This sort of comes from the controversies of the past, when people really argued about this sort of thing, that they'd get down to cases. But for the most part, they really don't believe. Most modern liberals aren't even sure of God. And Unitarians, for example, are kidded about believing there's not more than one God. And many of them are not at all sure there is a God at all. And of course, you've known in Trinitarian circles where the death of God movement has actually existed, and there's more than one person who's a member of a Trinitarian church today who doubts that there's one God, not to mention 3 persons in one God. I mean, we're way down the pike in this, and many people aren't even thinking about this sort of thing at all. But insofar as there is a liberalism which is standing for a way of acceptance with God, this is the way it's done, on the basis of your doing. You do this and you receive that, and so on. Now, as I said a moment ago, I would try to explain when we came to this why I put minus faith there, why I say about liberals that they're opposed to faith. Well, I don't mean, of course, that they're opposed to faith in general. They believe, of course, if you put one foot forward, that the world's going to be there to receive it when it goes down. When they post a letter, they have the same faith that the letter will, it may be a rather presumptuous faith these days and so on, but they have the same kind of faith that that letter is going to arrive. That they take some air in, it's going to find its way through its lungs and do its job in the body and so on. They believe in that sense of the word, to be sure. But they are opposed to faith in the sense in which it's used with respect to justification. Faith really means that you cast yourself as a suppliant on the mercy of God. You're a bankrupt sinner, and your only hope is in someone. That is absolutely anathema with a liberal mind. As one of them once said, this kind of religion, justification by faith alone, this is no religion for a gentleman. I mean, these people stand on the record. They're standing tall, and they don't need any help from God or man. They'll make it on their own, thank you, or they'll take the consequences of it. And it's just exactly the opposite of the poor in spirit who enter the kingdom of God. These people are rich in spirit. They may not talk that way, and they may sound very humble in their way of sounding, but in the last analysis, they're pitting their hopes on what they are and what they have done. And they are absolutely hostile to the notion that they have to cast themselves on the mercy of the court. Now, as I say, this second view, we're entering into the Christian area. This sort of thing, it really doesn't have any pretenses to be a Christian. I remember once when I had a Unitarian lecturer in my class in the cults at the seminary. He said at the outset, this isn't Christianity. Now, what Gerstner believes is Christianity. It's a religion of redemption, and he believes. He's naive enough to believe it. I don't believe it. It's nonsense as far as I'm concerned. Unitarianism isn't Christianity. I wish people were all as frank as that, as plain as that. It's perfectly true. Machen was right when he wrote a book entitled, way back in 23, Christianity and Liberalism are two different religions. So what in the world does this have to do with it? But the fact remains, there are probably, I hate to have to say this, but I'm afraid it's absolutely true, there are probably more Christians, more people in the Christian church today who are hoping to be justified on the basis of number one than any one of the others, or all of them combined. It shouldn't even be in the Christian church, but it is in the Christian church. It has always been in the Christian church. But anyway, we move into the area where we're putting faith where it belongs first. And we're talking about legitimate controversies among people who are ostensibly Christian when we come to these other four. And as I say, this second one is a particularly difficult one to explain, and I can only do it really by a couple illustrations. Let me explain why, when I talk about the neo-Orthodox movement as holding to faith brings justification minus works, why I put faith and justification in dotted lines to indicate that they don't mean, even though they use the words, and I'm not accusing them of insincerity, you understand, but nevertheless they have a kind of meaning which is different from the others. And if they suggest that it's the same, then of course I would have to accuse them of dishonesty, but I don't think that's their fundamental reason. They just think differently about the matter, but they may not notice. It's so different that it really ought not to go by the same name. But let me try to explain, for example, what I mean by saying faith, in their way of thinking, ought to be put in dotted lines because they're not talking about the same thing. When neo-Orthodoxy, we think of it as being born in 1921 when Karl Barth published the second edition of his Römer Brief, his commentary on the book of Romans. Well, usually we're a couple decades behind Europe on these theological developments, and it was really in the 40s before neo-Orthodoxy was making a great deal of impact in these United States. At that time, I was at the very liberal Harvard University doing doctoral work, and they had no use for orthodoxy, neo-orthodoxy, or any other kind of orthodoxy. They hadn't even, except for historical purposes and study and so on, they hadn't had anything to do with that really since the days of Cotton Mather, practically. They're far down the pike of liberalism. So it was quite a phenomenon when urbane, liberal Harvard had Reinhold Niebuhr come up there to lecture. Reinhold Niebuhr was a lecturer at Union Seminary in New York and was one of the outstanding advocates of a form of neo-orthodoxy in this country. So he came up to Harvard to lecture. The professor who introduced him was Dr. Julius Seeley Bixler, who sat in his rocking chair with his meerschaum pipe, smoking very blandly, while his friend Reinhold Niebuhr took the rostrum and he thundered like some god from Mount Olympus, and he rang the changes of denunciation on liberalism, and he told these Harvard liberal faculty and students alike, some of us were conservative, but all the faculty liberal and most of the students liberal, and so on. This liberal notion of Jesus is absolutely false. Jesus Christ is no mere man, he said to the Harvard liberals. Jesus Christ is God. Now, if you had left that lecture after hearing that emphasis on Jesus Christ is God and no mere man, you would have thought that maybe Harold John Ockengay had slipped surreptitiously over there incognito to deliver the lecture. Perhaps John Calvin had risen from the dead. To hear these accents on Harvard campus would have been refreshing to any evangelical soul. But if you'd stayed for the discussion which followed, you'd hear a student rise and say, Dr. Niebuhr, you have denounced the liberal view of Jesus as a mere man. That we understand. Now, you say Jesus Christ is God, and you've rung the changes on the proposition that Jesus Christ is God. What do you mean, Dr. Niebuhr, when you say Jesus Christ is God? And what Niebuhr said in answer to that was, not the Orthodox meaning. That is, not ontic deity. I remember his using that term, not ontic deity. When I say Jesus Christ is God, I don't mean that he's eternally existing deity. I don't mean he's a second person in the Trinity and so on. Then another student rose, and he said, Dr. Niebuhr, you've made it very, very clear that you don't believe that Jesus Christ is a mere man, and you've denounced us liberals. Now you've made it equally clear that you're not Orthodox either, and you denounce the Orthodox as well, and you condemn the Council of Chalcedon and the whole historic tradition on this matter. What do you mean? We know what you don't mean. What do you mean when you say that Jesus Christ is God? And he used the term, as some people sometimes call it today, myth. Some will call it witness. Christ is a witness to God. He used the term, at the moment it's slipping me, the very term he used, he repeated it again in his nature and destiny of man. And but the point was this. The term he used was to indicate that he didn't mean that Christ was man or that Christ was God. And the question was, what did he mean? And if these students were trying to find out by these questions, they didn't get any answer on that. They learned only that he didn't mean this and he didn't mean that, and that he used a word like myth or witness or pointer to for the term, but what exactly it meant, nobody could possibly tell. And you could read his writings, you could read Barth's writings, you could read Brunner's writings, you could read Turnison, you can read any of the people in this school of thought. And if you can give a clear definition of any essential doctrine which they mean, let me know about it. It certainly eludes comprehension. So here, we have to have faith in Christ, see. Christ is the center of the whole drama. He is the basis of justification, and faith is the way of justification. Faith in whom? Who is this Christ? He isn't a mere man. He isn't God. Who is he? He's a myth. He's a pointer. He's an indication. But what exactly? Niebuhr couldn't tell us. Niebuhr didn't tell us later. None of these persons will tell us. So what is his faith? I say, we understand what liberalism means, and we understand what orthodoxy means. But this defies comprehension. Now, the same thing is true with respect to justification. Here again, I guess, if I can do this quickly, this often is discussed in neo-Orthodox circles in terms of a Latin formula that comes actually from Martin Luther. Man is at the same time, justus, righteous, simul, justus, simul, peccator, sinner. You see, when Luther used that term with respect to justification, what he meant by it was that at the very moment that the person is declared free of his sin and righteous in Jesus Christ, he still is a sinner. This happens to the ungodly. Not that after that transaction takes place, the man remains the same kind of sinner he was that he was before. But neo-orthodoxy never reaches that type of clarity. It simply leaves this statement as saying that the same person who's a sinner is now righteous. Tillich, for example, in Shaking of the Foundations, has a sermon on the woman who washed Christ's feet with her tears, and Tillich interprets her as a prostitute, and of course Tillich may be right, the record doesn't say so, but she may well have been a woman of the street. You can see the way Tillich is interpreting that this woman of the street comes and adores Jesus Christ, and she's just even while she's a sinner. And while even Tillich seems to hesitate to quite say out loud what he's driving at, there's no mistaking. That woman apparently continued her prostitution. She went out as she came in, a woman of the streets, but now justus as well as peccator. We read a theologian returning home in Holland one time, and he was approached by a prostitute, and he turned her overtures down. Then he went on to say, it wouldn't have made any difference if I'd gone with her or not. My relationship to God depends on Jesus Christ, not that woman. Now, that man may have been faithful to his own wife and may die faithful to his one wife. His point is, however, that his relationship with respect to the seventh or any other commandment has nothing to do with it as far as his justification is concerned. Now, you see, if you're using justification that way, that without any change in the person himself, just because God is arbitrarily, for no reason, because these people don't have any notion of propitiation and things of that sort, he is declared just. That's a caricature of what we mean by justification. You can shout from the rooftops as long as you want that the just shall live by faith. In that sense of the word, that's not a meaningful proposition. You're saying that somebody is just who's a sinner. There's no change in the person at all. He just arbitrarily calls something he isn't. in the genuine doctrine, this person really is just, because the guilt of his sin is removed, the power of it's broken, and so on. The justice that's given to him is by divine grace, but it's given to him. It's not a fiction. It's not a make-believe. It's not an artificial affair. Now, so much for that matter. I do say, with respect to the works, they're in bold print. Neo-Orthodox think about works the same way, and many of them have exhibited some heroic works in their fidelity to Jesus Christ. I mentioned Bach, for example. He resisted Hitler when his life was on the line, and so did Paul Tillich, and so did a number of these persons. When they talk about works, they're talking about the same sort of thing, but when they talk about justification, it's another matter. Now let's take a time with this matter of antinomianism. Let's say the thing that really threatens evangelicalism, not neo-orthodoxy or liberalism or Catholicism, but this matter of antinomianism. Faith brings justification minus works. At this particular point, these people are utterly orthodox. They mean faith in the proper sense of the word, and they mean justification in the full sense of the word. But minus works. Now, in all fairness to the antinomians, they don't say that you should live it up and be as immoral as you possibly could be. They don't discourage works. Many of them abound in works. What they do say is that that is not essential, so that if you don't do any good works, deplorable as that may be, it will break your fellowship, but it will not threaten your justification. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus. You be in Jesus, but not happy in Jesus. You break your fellowship, but not real right. Your standing, no. Your state, yes, and so on. But the point is, you could be as immoral as it was possible to be. They don't recommend it, but they defend it, that you could be as immoral as it's possible to be and still be justified by faith alone. Free from the law, oh blessed condition, I can sin as I please and still have remission. They don't recommend that you sin as you please, but they'll defend the proposition that if you do sin as you please, you still have remission if you're in Christ. Now we say that's fatal. Why? Because faith without works is dead. It doesn't exist. And if faith doesn't exist, there is no justification whatsoever. Absolutely fatal. And it doesn't make any difference how orthodox you may be with respect to the person of Christ and the sacrifice of Christ and the necessity of faith or justification. That justification is by a living faith, a working faith, and if that faith is not working, it is not real faith and not justification. Now, just a hasty moment with respect to Rome. We'll develop this a little bit more in the next lecture, but the great Roman difference is this. They put the works here. But you see, I'll only have time to mention this much. If this is not sufficient, then Jesus didn't pay at all, and so a person is guilty, whether he intends it or not, of blasphemy. And if these works in any way contribute to justification, then, of course, you're claiming something for yourself that you couldn't possess. You're putting Christ down, and you're putting yourself up. You're saying he doesn't do something he does do, and you can do something you can't do. And so I say to any of you who are thinking of that as a way of justification, it can never happen that way. And the Reformation was no mistake. Faith brings justification, and then the works come. The works are absolutely essential, but it's absolutely essential to recognize that they contribute to justification absolutely nothing. Shall we pray? Lord Jesus, strip us of all pride. Make us realize our absolute dependence upon Thee, and grant that each one of us may come not only with word, but in spirit, saying, just as I am, without one plea, but that Thy blood was shed for me. In Christ's name, amen.